One of the difficult things about teaching the scriptures, they're very old, and they talk about a group of people who live a long ways from us, and people who lived a long time ago. And so one of the hard things is to see does this have anything to do with me? Where we are in Acts, we've got this story of these Christians who were persecuted, and they were persecuted in such a way that they had to scatter, they had to flee from their homes. What does that have to do with us? Why should you care about hearing this? I don't think that's an unfair question. If God is truth, and if the gospel is truth, and if it's life-changing, and if it's useful, if it's given us all that we need for life and godliness and all this that we believe, then these stories should all somehow have some kind of meaning for us even now. These stories should all have something to tell us about God and reveal something about ourselves and preach the gospel and make us worship, right? Is that wrong to think that? These stories should have meaning for us right now. And so what I want you to think about, let's just start. I'm going to read Acts chapter 8, the first 8 verses. And I want you to think about, what does this have to do with me? What does this tell me about Christ? That's the bigger question. I mean, to say, what does it have to do with me? There's nothing wrong with asking it that way, as long as what you mean is, what does this tell me about Christ? How does this reveal God? How does this reveal God's will, God's nature, His character, what God has done? What does it tell me about His promise? Let's just start with that and see if we can answer some of those questions. We left off with the stoning of Stephen. Stephen preached the gospel to these people. It was kind of a harsh version, though, wasn't it? They said he committed blasphemy. They said that because you teach that this man Jesus was who that he was, you're disrespecting Moses and God, and you hate the temple and you hate the law, and the penalty for that is death. And so he preached back to them, and he turned the tables. He said, no, actually, you are the blasphemers. You've always been the blasphemers. Your fathers killed everybody that God ever sent. Even though God showed himself time after time throughout this entire history of Israel, we've had nothing but rebellion, complaining, people dragging their feet, hating God, rejecting the people that God sends. He says, you stiff-necked people, always resisting the Holy Spirit. And of course, that set them off. They lost their minds. They drug him outside, and they threw rocks at him until he died from it. Well, we read there at the end that all of the people laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, we pick up the story. After Stephen died, Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now, those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ. And the crowds with one accord paid attention to what was being said by Philip when they heard him and saw the signs that he did. For unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who had them. And many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city. So what's this have to do with us? Does this tell us about God? What does it tell us about Christ? What does it tell us about the gospel? Start off with this man named Saul. And we know his story, so it's a lot easier for us in hindsight to look back. But I want you to pay attention to all of the drama, the pain and suffering, the persecution, all of the things that if you'd been living in that time, imagine living in that time. We read this story, right? We've got Philip, and Philip goes on this journey, right? He's scattered. And we know what happens to him. But wait, stop for a second and back up. Who were Philip's parents? What do you think happened? What was the conversation right before he left? Did he even get to talk to him? Were they on his side? Were they against him? Were they some of those that maybe were persecuting the church? What about his brothers and sisters? What about his wife and children? Did he take them with him? Did he have any? Did he leave them? Did he have to get up in the middle of the night and run? How do you think he felt? What were the thoughts in his head as he was walking down that road or running down that road and trying to stay away from strangers maybe as he first left Jerusalem. Trying to stay away from people he actually knew. It kind of makes me think about Joseph's story. I mean, Joseph, can you imagine you're minding your own business and then you're in this confrontation with your brothers and they grab you, 10 of them, and you're young, you're the youngest of the group. There's nothing you can do to stop them and they throw you down inside of a well so deep you can't get out. What do you think his mindset was at that time? Do you think he was rejoicing in the Lord always? You think he was clapping his hands, thanking God for his current situation? I don't think he was he? He was literally at the bottom of a pit. Philip finds himself taking this walk because some guy named Saul got it in his head that it was great to kill people who didn't stay to what he thought was the truth. It wasn't just Saul, there were a bunch of them. And Luke knows all this. He's writing this down. He wants us to understand and to feel the same things. He wants us to see how God continues to move and what God continues to do to keep his promise, even though all of these bad things are happening. And so we start out by reading that. There was this guy, Saul. And he approved of the execution. He wasn't just there. He wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was there. There's some debate over what it means that they were laying their cloaks at his feet, but there's no debate about the fact that he was a participant. He was enabling them to do what they were doing. He was giving them a thumbs up. That's right, throw those rocks. He hated Christ. He hated the gospel. For him, it wasn't good news at all. When that happened, that day that they all threw rocks at Stephen, I mean, can you imagine? I saw a picture. I was looking around for some art for it. And I saw the people they had their rocks up in the air. And there was like a bush with three guys kind of peeking over the top of it. And it wasn't comical at all. It was like, very old art. I don't know when it was drawn, but, medieval kind of looking art. And these guys are looking over the bush, and you just wonder, I wonder if that's how it really was. Because you can almost picture, as soon as they get done with him, they stop and they say, now where are his friends? And his friends suddenly realize we're not just watching his execution, we've become a part of it. We are now in danger. And so people start searching, and they're looking for anybody who's related to the gospel, anybody who's ever said anything good about this man Jesus, who's such a heretic and a false prophet. And all of them have to flee. And Saul's not content with just kicking them out of the city. He's not content to let them go at all. He goes to their homes. They kick in their doors. They drag them out, entire families, men, women, and children. What do you think they did to them? If they executed Stephen after a trial, what do you think happened to these other families? Do you think they just threw him in a prison and forgot about him? Do you think they continued to investigate and interrogate? And I wonder how many of those people continued to confess Christ and how many of those people ended with the same fate as Philip. What a terrible time. What a terrible time to be alive. What a terrible thing to have to see and to endure. Can there be any good in this? Can we see that God's keeping his promise in this? Can we say that God is loving and that all things work together for the good of those who love him through this? God, I thought that you were on our side and that no weapon formed against me shall prosper. Isn't that what it said? I thought that's what it said. And they're about to do to me what they did to him. But there are some good things here, aren't there? It's not a total loss, is it? In fact, if you don't know the whole story, it might look like a total loss. But when you can zoom out and be at a safe distance like we are and read the whole story, you say, man, that's actually a good thing. It was actually a good thing what God let happen to those people. And the reason is, you have, first of all, it says that everybody fled except for the apostles. And later we'll see that they're writing letters to the new churches, especially the Gentile churches, and they're instructing them on this is how you ought to live now that you've heard the gospel. Now that we're in this time of the new covenant, now that we know that God has welcomed you in as part of his family, this is how you ought to live. They're giving instruction. Why were they able to do that? Well, they were able to do it because they knew the promise of God. They were there when Jesus said, I'm going to send you out to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. They could see that God was keeping his promise, and they knew that Jerusalem was right where they were supposed to be. And so they give us this example of what it means to trust in God's promise. It gives us an example of what it means to take courage. And these other guys, devout men who buried who buried Stephen, they made great lamentation. There was a law that said if somebody is a blasphemer, if somebody dies by stoning, you can bury them, but you cannot make a big deal over their death. You can't, make great lamentation over their death. But they did it anyway. Imagine the courage it took for them to do that, to say, this man was a man of God. Though you've said this, here's what we're going to do. And you see, I think what those two things do, you have the apostles and the devout men, that they're not scattering from the faith. And a lot of people had to flee for their lives. But the apostles stood strong and they said, no, this is worth dying for. And I imagine that word got out. It gets out to us at least. This gospel is worth dying for. Even if it means that we have to suffer persecution. Maybe the best part of it, right there in verse 4. What happened to those who were scattered? They went about doing what? Preaching the word. They went about preaching the word. It couldn't have felt great at that time, could it? But you see how helpful it was? I think about that verse that says, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. I mean, we picture that, if you know the Old Testament reference, somebody coming over a mountain and they come down into a village and they're going to preach the good news. How about if you're in Samaria, and you know the story of Samaria? Do you remember this? During the exile, you remember so people in Israel, actually Judah, they weren't living right. And so the Babylonians came over and grabbed them and took them back home for 70 years. No, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up my stories. This is the Assyrians. Same basic thing happened. The Assyrians came down from up here, from the north, and they captured a lot of them, killed a whole bunch of them, tortured and mutilated a bunch of them. And their policy was that they would take people out of the land, they would take the rich especially, and leave just the poor. And then they'd go conquer another territory and take those people and repopulate different areas. And so that way, you have people who have different cultures, of different religions, of different languages, and they can't all gather together and rebel. So when the Assyrians did this, when they took Israel out of their land and left the poor, they also brought other people back inside, and those groups mixed. And you end up with half-breeds. People with mixed religion, people with mixed ideas. But when the Jews came back, and they're pure, they know their genealogy, there was this group of half-breeds there. They were kind of Jewish, but also kind of pagan. And they hated them more than they hated the Gentiles. You read in, I think it's John 4:9, they had nothing to do with the Samaritans. It was the Samaritans who said, you Jews say we worship over here. Remember the woman at the well? We say, God is worshipped over here, so which is it? There was a big rift in between them. Can you imagine being a Samaritan at that time and not knowing the gospel? Now, you've probably heard something about this man, Jesus. Maybe you've heard that he died. And one day here comes this man and he's hoofing it. He's going as fast as he can. He's trying to get out of town. And for some reason, he stops and he starts talking to you. And during your conversation, this man who's on the run for his life, maybe they knew that, maybe they didn't. Maybe he didn't tell him. I wouldn't tell him I was on the run. But whatever it is, he starts talking and he starts telling him the gospel while he's on the run. He's preaching the word. Why? Because the word is worth dying for. Because the word is worth telling, even to your enemies, even to the people who you traditionally hate. And those people, they hear this gospel being preached to them. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. How wonderful that, I was sitting here minding my own business, and I don't know if you would have ever come through Samaria, because it just wasn't customary. But God sent that man Saul, and he let Stephen die. And they all turned at you, and they all started yelling at you and throwing rocks at you, and you ran for your life, and now here you are, you're sitting in my house, and because I just gave you something to drink, you've told me this good news. Now, can we not agree that all things work together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose? Can we not agree here? Can we not see here that God uses even this terrible persecution, the death of this man, and the deaths of who knows how many others? But why did they die? They died because of what they believed. So what happened to them when they died? They received the promise, did they not? And when they died, they received the promise. The people who benefit from their deaths are people who hear the gospel, see its faithfulness, see God's goodness and his grace, and now they also believe. Is that not a worthy cause? Is that not a good reason to die? So we can see here that God knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, it reminds me of some of the other stories, like when Joseph was sent to Egypt. He was sent ahead of them, and it was torture for him. It was horrible for him. And you get this image in your head. We kind of have this hero worship mentality sometimes for people of the Bible, these heroes of the faith, right? And I imagine he was like a monk every day, no emotion. He was just trusting in God the whole way. No, I seriously doubt that. I'll bet you there were some days that he wept. I'll bet you there were some days that he was so angry and depressed. God, what are you doing? The thing wasn't that he was perfect. The thing was that the gospel held him through, that God's grace saw him through. And then when it came time, that moment of truth, his brothers are terrified and they're shaking and maybe they're crying and they know what he's going to do. He says, no, I'm not doing that. You see, I can see that God knew what he was doing when he sent me here. And I love the end of that section there in Acts chapter 8. It says, so there was much joy in that city. Look at the contrast. Saul kicking down doors, people, families being taken, families being executed. But there was much joy in that city. Because the people who had to leave, they went about preaching the gospel. They went about telling the story of Jesus, telling them about the Messiah, we'll read down here. You see, the Samaritans' joy was at Stephen's expense. At the expense of the whole church, really. Their joy came at someone else's expense. It came because someone else suffered. Now, I asked you at the beginning, how does this connect with us? I mean, it's hard to do, right? It's hard to see how can this suffering and persecution fit my daily life. Let me ask you this. Can you think of any examples? Can you think of an example specifically that your joy has come from someone else's suffering? Is that not the gospel? Is that not what the gospel is? I mean, God sent his only begotten Son to die in our place. We just sang the song about amazing grace. What is that amazing grace? It's not just that he hasn't treated me as my sins deserved. It also includes the fact that he laid upon him the iniquities of us all. He hadn't done anything, had he? Did he deserve that cross? Did he deserve that crown of thorns, those beatings, those nails? Did he deserve any of that? No, he didn't. But God laid it all upon him, and by his stripes I am healed. My joy comes at his expense. Your joy, your life. So in this story, I wouldn't call it a type, but I would say it's definitely a parallel where we have Philip on one hand, who is the bringer of good news, the one who had to suffer so that they could hear. And when they hear, there's healing and salvation. What's this have to do with us? You see it, don't you? God works all things together for our good. He brings us joy and healing through the suffering of his Son. And we can be as confident as those disciples, we can stand, or those apostles, we can stand strong in our faith. We can stand against the world when they say, you can't do that. Like those devout men who said, no, we're going to honor him as a man of God. We can have that same attitude. And we can see these things that happen to us. I mean, what kind of suffering are you going through? How is it any different than Job's or Joseph's or David's or Jeremiah's or Stephen's or Philip's or Jesus's? Do you not see how maybe you're going to have hard days, right? I mean, you may have long seasons that are hard. Doubt and fear and guilt and grief and pain. The difference between someone who believes and someone who doesn't is not that we don't suffer those things. The difference is that we do it in hope. I don't know how God is going to use my sufferings for my good and the good of the church. Just like Joseph didn't and just like Philip didn't. But I trust his word. He will use all of these things for who? The good of those who love him. Those who are called according to his purpose. I think that's one of the mistakes that we make sometimes is we hear that verse and we say, okay, so God, what's the good for me? Well, maybe it's not for you. It's for the good of those who love him. It's for the people around you, for the people you don't even know. We can worship him in confidence and in faith because we know that he knows what he's doing. And we wait on him to fulfill his promise. Jesus, today we lift you up. You are the focus of the gospel and of our hearts. And so may we be confident like these people were confident. May we rejoice in you and preach you as we go. And God, may you do your work of healing and salvation because you have earned it by your own suffering. We praise you now in Jesus' name. Amen.